Okay, so a brief little reminder before we start with the message for today, and that is that we have started this sermon series looking at the misconceptions and misquotations and misunderstandings that we might have about God in the Bible. The things we may have heard that aren't necessarily true, and I've shared with you every week, and I want to keep reminding you. If you have any you want to have a message done on that you want to talk about, email me, send me a text, call me, stop in and say, hey, how about this idea? I've gotten a few, but I want to make sure that we talk about all the things you'd like to talk about. I have the list that I have, but I keep adding to it when you share more. We'll keep this sermon series going for as long as there are questions and thoughts. The first idea, though, that we're tackling in this series about those misconceptions and misquotations and misunderstandings is the idea that God has inexhaustible patience. Now, I know that not everyone has heard that, but I've been a pastor in lots of different places, and everywhere I've been, someone has some idea of this. Some idea that this patience of God is infinite and never-ending. I know that may not sound like much of a big deal, but it really is if you unpack what that means. In all the places I've been, too often I have heard people of God who build their theology on the idea that God is this uber-patient Father who has an unlimited amount of chances offered to us as God's children. And because of that, people don't feel like they need to be too serious or too committed or too dedicated or too devoted to their lives as God's people. Because at the end of the day, God is infinitely patient and waits on us to pull all the pieces together. I've heard that said just that way or something like that. And the problem with it is that this idea of God's infinite patience doesn't seem to exist anywhere in Scripture as a quality of God. There are tons of Scripture that we could look at in relation to this idea of God not having this infinite amount of patience. Here's a few for you. Like when Job showed up to complain to God about how things were going. And God, I love the Scripture, God says, as Job was complaining and getting done, he's like, are you done? Let me tell you something. Where were you when I did all the fantastic things? That was not a patient statement. There was a time the people looked around and they said, all the other nations have kings. We want a king. And God said, no, you don't. You don't want kings. Kings will take your children from you. They'll force them into war. They'll do all kinds of things. I am here for you. And the people said, no, we wanted a king. And God said, fine. There's the entire book of Judges. If you spent time with Judges, it's my favorite book. The repeating story is the people of God turn away from God and do all kinds of wild and crazy things till things get super bad and they say, God, save us. And God sends them a judge, and they do. And when that judge dies, they turn away again. And God's like, okay, have it your way. There's a whole lot of times in the book of Judges that God's like, it's okay, do what you want. It's cool. There is the end of the Old Testament before the New Testament when God was silent for about 400 years. As we go into the New Testament, there is Jesus kicking the moneylenders out of the temple. There is Jesus calling Peter Satan. There is Jesus rolling up into where the religious leaders were and dropping the 7 woes on them. We could go on and on with plenty of examples from Scripture about God not having this inexhaustible patience, about God not being just saying, okay, you know what, you guys do whatever, it's cool, I'm here, I'm with you on it. But the one that I want to look at this morning is from the book of Numbers. A little background before we look at the text. At this point, the Israelites have been wandering around the desert for about 6 months to a year after being freed from slavery in Egypt. So this is at the start of the Exodus. This is early on. Now, early on, they have already faced several struggles. Struggles related to safety, food, and water. They have already been complaining a ton. And this time, what's happening in Numbers 11, they are complaining about the food that God had provided them. They're complaining about the manna. They're like, look, this manna has made us weak. We want meat. We want something different. In this complaining, they even actually talked about how much better things were in Egypt when they were slaves. How much better it was that they could have fish and onions and leeks and all these vegetables and fruits. Everything besides manna. And so we get God's response to this complaining in Numbers 11, 16 through 23. So the Lord said to Moses, gather for me the 70 elders of Israel whom you know to be the elders of the people and officers over them. Bring them to the tent of meeting and have them take their place there with you. I will come down and talk with you there. I will take some of the spirit that is on you and put it on them, and they shall bear the burden of the people along with you, so that you will not bear it all by yourself. And say to the people, consecrate yourselves tomorrow, you shall have meat. You have wailed in the hearing of the Lord, saying, if only we had meat to eat, surely it was better for us in Egypt. Therefore the Lord will give you meat, and you shall eat. You should not eat only 1 day, or 2 days, or 5 days, or 10 days, or 20 days, but for a whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you, because you've rejected the Lord who is among you, and have wailed before him, saying, why did we ever leave Egypt? But Moses said, the people I am with number 600,000 on foot, and you say I will give them meat, that they may eat for a whole month? Are there enough flocks and herds to slaughter for them? Are there enough fish in the sea to catch for them? And the Lord said to Moses, is the Lord's power limited? Now you shall see whether my word will come true for you or not. I'm going to confess, I picked that scripture on purpose. I could have done this message on any of the other ones, but I like that one. I like it when God comes through and God says, you know what? Let me tell you something. Let me share something with you. In this particular scripture, God is hot. He's angry. The people have exhausted that inexhaustible patience with complaining, with their trash talking about the manna that God had provided them with every day, with their talking about how much better it was in Egypt. Essentially what it's coming down to is they are complaining and whining, and it comes down to a lack of trust in God, a lack in contentment, a lack in understanding the blessing that they are receiving by getting this manna. They want something different. They want what they think they should have. They want things to be their way. And so God makes the statement that God will give them meat. So much meat that comes out of their nostrils. So much so that it disgusts them to see it. And even Moses doesn't trust God. Even Moses questions God. It's like, I don't know that can happen. Is there enough cattle? Is there enough fish? And God gets saucy with Moses too, asking him, is there a limit to my power? Just wait and see. As you continue on in this scripture, you have this. Then a wind went out from the Lord, and it brought quails from the sea and let them fall beside the camp, about a day's journey on this side and a day's journey on the other side, all around the camp, about 2 cubits deep on the ground. So the people worked all day and all night, and all the next day, gathering the quails. The least anyone gathered was 10 homers, and they spread them out for themselves all around the camp. But while the meat was still between their teeth, before it was consumed, the anger of the Lord was kindled against the people, and the Lord struck the people with a very great plague. Does anybody know how many 10 homers are? Anybody ever look up measurements in the Bible? Because they use funky words. 10 homers is about 475 pounds. And we're told in the scripture that is the least amount that was collected. Not what everybody got. The least amount anybody got was 475 pounds of quail. That's a lot. And we're told in the scripture that they spread it out all around the camp. Now technically this is part of the curing process to preserve the meat. You would spread it out and let the sun do its work, but also you would put salt and different things on it to keep it from spoiling. But we aren't told in the scripture that they did that. It just said they laid the quail around. We are told in the scripture if they had enough time or resources to properly preserve it. This idea that's shared of this plague that killed the people, many biblical scholars essentially believe that there was too much meat laying around. They believe that it created toxins and bacteria, that it spoiled. There are many cases in history of quail poisoning. The idea is that the people may have died from food poisoning from all the meat that was spread all around that they had complained to God about not having. I know these scriptures are not our favorite views of God. They're not the favorite way that we like to read about God. The God who got angry, the God who is impatient, the God who says quail is going to be coming out of your nose. I just cannot leave that image behind. The God whose anger still burned after they got the quail, and a great plague came among the people and many died. That's not the God that we like to talk about. We like to talk about the God that is loving, the God that is providing, the God that is defending. Not the God that says, okay, have it your way. That's ultimately what is happening here in this text. Up to this time, God has done all God could do for the people. God freed the people from bondage in Egypt. God kept the people safe, running from Egypt. God provided for the people. And yet the people were not content. They complained and they whined. They actually looked back to the past with veiled eyes where they only saw the things that they liked. Anybody ever done that? Anybody look back to the past and like, oh, it was so much better then. And all you're really seeing is the stuff that you liked. You're just ignoring all the stuff that was not cool, that you struggled through, that were issues. That's what the people are doing. That's how they could make that statement about how much things were better in Egypt. When we were forced to make bricks, when we were beaten, when we were slaves. They only saw the things they liked before, and not the things that were horrible. This is what they're bringing before God. And so while we don't like this scripture, it does give us an important lesson that we need to know, that we need to embrace. That instead of the safe and warm and fuzzy, always patient with our shenanigans God, there is the God that, while is patient, has a point where that patience is used up. A God who says, you know what? You aren't into what I'm doing. It's not enough. You don't like it. You think you need something different. You think you know more. You think you know better. So have it your way. And let's see what happens. In these moments, God essentially turns us over to ourselves. All of those examples I gave you earlier, God does that. God says, fine. Have it your way. I'm going to let you do. I'm going to turn you over to yourselves and your actions. Sometimes God may even give us the thing that we are asking for, that we are begging for, instead of what God has for us. And what the scripture teaches us is that when that happens, there's going to be calamity. There's going to be hardship. There's going to be suffering. There's any number of things that happen that we are not going to be happy with, that are going to cause us harm and danger. I know as I stand here this morning, I sound like a downer, right? Nobody comes to church and is like, hey, tell us all the places that are not awesome and not cool. Tell us that God is impatient with us and will turn us over to ourselves and it will not be awesome. As I share these things, it may even make God sound to some people capricious, maybe even petulant. But before you go there, before you carry that thought with you, there's something else there. In the midst of God saying, fine, have it your way, and in the midst of God turning us over to our whims and wants and desires, in the midst of God saying, my patience is at an end, there is always the presence of God still. While God may not have inexhaustible patience, God does have inexhaustible presence. If you go on reading about the Israelites in Scripture, if you go read any of those other things that I share with you about examples of the places where God does not have inexhaustible patience, you will always find one thing. God is present. God does not leave. God does not turn away. Even though God is not patient at times, even though God says, have it your way, even though these things happen, God is still present. God is still there. These Israelite people, as they wander through the desert, will repeat this idea, this story many times, with many complaints, and with God being impatient and saying, fine. But every time they do it, every time they exhaust God's patience, and God lets them do things their way, God is still there when they turn back. God is still there when they realize they were wrong. When they realize that what God has done and God will do for them is what should happen, is what's best. That they don't have to search God out. They don't have to convince God to come back. That was something that happened in antiquity. That's one of the places and things that is different about the God that we worship. In antiquity, all the other gods, they had to be catered to. They had to be cajoled. They had to be talked to and convinced. Come and do for us. Come and be with us. Come and provide. Our God was just there. Never gone. All we have to do is turn. All we have to do is turn back to God and say, God, I messed up. I did this wrong. and God's there. God never leaves. God never abandons. This morning I want to share with you that is where hope is. I've had a lot of people over the last few weeks talk to me about hope. Where do they find hope in the world that we see around us today? We see all the things that are going on, all the stuff that isn't right. Where is hope? And that hope is that God is ever present with us. Or regardless of how many times we exhaust God's patience, God will always be there. We live in a world today that needs that hope. We live in a world today that is not as God would have it be. A world that we have allowed to come into existence. A world where we may have exhausted God's patience and God has said, okay, do things your way. Again, that question has been asked many times. Why does God allow all of this stuff to happen? That's not the right question. The right question is, why do we allow all of this stuff to happen? God gave everything to us. God said, you're in charge. God also said, here's the things to do with this, and we ignored them. God tells us to be selfless. And what are we? Selfish. God tells us to bring love, to lift people up, to care for people. And what do? We care for just ourselves. We take things into ourselves. God tells us to not be about power, and yet we have people seeking power. God tells us to care for all the hurt and the left out, the unseen and the unwanted. And what do? We ignore them even more. The world we live in is not the one that God intended. But what God did intend was for the people of God to do the work, to be in the world, to make change, to do better, to share that hope of God's presence everywhere that they go. We live in a world that we may have exhausted God's patience. And again, God has said, do things your way and see how that works. But in the midst of all that we have done, in the midst of what seems to be hopeless, God has not left us. God is present with us. And because of that, we can have hope that tomorrow doesn't have to be like today. And we can carry that hope with us all the time, in every situation, in every way. And so this morning, what I want to share with you is don't spend time contemplating or thinking about God's inexhaustible patience, that God will always just let you do whatever and it's all cool and God has no issues. That's not true, but God does have inexhaustible presence. God is with us in the midst of the mess that we have made. And if we will turn, if we will seek God out, if we will look and say, God, I messed it up. If we will submit and be the people that God has made us to be. Do the things that God has made us to do. I know it'll be small, it'll be incremental, but things will get better. I believe that. As we embrace hope, as we embrace the light and the darkness, as we add to it our light and our hope, it grows. So this morning, I don't know where you are with these things, but I hope you'll take time this week contemplating, praying, asking God, things are messed up. It's not working the way we're doing. Tell me what to do. Guide me, lead me. Let me be someone who brings hope. As Lauren comes up to lead us in our final song, I hope this morning that you will do with this message, do with these words as God might lead you to. If God leads you this morning to stand and to sing, please do that. If God leads you to sit and to pray and talk with God, please do that. If God leads you to go sit with someone else and talk with them, do that. Whatever God leads you to do is not wrong. And don't ever worry about whatever somebody thinks about what you're doing. If you're following God's lead, you're right. I want to invite all who are led and all who are able to stand and to sing.